Well, everyone, hot off the press. I'm looking here as I'm reading through this. It looks like it was signed on April the 17th, published on DOJ's website, April 21st. The federal government settles really a false claims case with Walgreens. Now, as I read the case, there was a couple lessons that really jumped out at me. But if I don't know if you do get into this, sometimes I will read the settlements. I didn't see the corporate integrity agreement. I'm sure there either is one or is one to follow, but I'm just talking about the settlement itself. So Walgreens agreed to settle for $300 million, the largest case related to opioids and drugs, I believe, in the DOJ's history. Certainly, at a case like this, you add certain other conditions based on Walgreens' profitability. In fact, the settlement has a whole litany of different things that could change that settlement, but really only change it going up. So, with interest and everything, could be upwards of $351 million. The base is 300. What was interesting is there's a couple lessons that we learned in here. First, I'll talk about just the settlement. Number one, the government definitely wants to make an example out of Walgreens. No doubt about that. And they want to punish Walgreens. But they don't want to make Walgreens insolvent. In fact, in the settlement agreement itself, Walgreens attests to the fact that these fines and penalties will not make us insolvent. So I thought that was also interesting. So Walgreens can't later claim, well, we're just going to go bankrupt. And then, like some businesses, if they have a judgment against them, will close down and open up under another name. They basically agree they can't do that because they agreed this doesn't make them insolvent. Um, in addition to that, as I'm just reading through this, the uh, the government, while creating this punishment and not make them insolvent, also gives them a time period to pay this off. So the full amount has to be paid by, I'm reading this, April 18th of 2031. So in essence, about 6 years, about 6 years from now. So that was kind of interesting to me. How this case, this is fascinating. I'd like to know more about this, but this was the allegation from the federal government that Walgreens knowingly filled opioid prescriptions, knowing that the prescription was either false or it was improper, or it was being prescribed by someone who had a history of prescribing, really overprescribing opioids. So it's interesting when I think about that, at least up to that point, the criminality really likely is on the provider who's writing a false prescription or is overprescribing or is not meeting certain criteria in treating patients. It's really not medically necessary for the treatment of a patient. So Walgreens didn't actually commit that, but they filled the prescription knowing that was likely the case. In addition, it says that Walgreens really pressured their pharmacists to fill these prescriptions timely, quickly, not to really take the time to look into some of these cases or some of these prescriptions that look like they were a real problem. And by the way, the government claims there were millions of these. So this is not one pharmacy, one particular case. It is a systematic failure of compliance. The relators in the case, in actuality, well, let me backtrack. How well Walgreens is really getting tagged for this is because then they turn around and they build Medicare, they build government programs for these opioid prescriptions. And that's where the government said, well, wait a second. These were likely fraudulent prescriptions, inappropriate prescriptions. You filled them, then you billed the patient's insurance, which basically Medicare beneficiaries. Therefore, that's a false claims, and you did this knowing intent and intentionally. And if you know anything about the False Claims Act, you can literally be fined up. It's not quite 30,000. I don't think. I haven't checked what the actual amount is this year, but it's in the upper 20,000s per claim submitted. So it is significant. So to come up with $300 million in settlement dollars, typically the government is settling between 8-10 cents on the dollar. So it's likely the government said, if you don't settle, we're going to go after $3 billion of restitution. Thus, you can see why Walgreens would settle. And of course, Walgreens in the settlement agreement says, hey, no admission of wrongdoing, but it sounds pretty bad. So there were four relators in this case. And as you know, that means they file suit against Walgreens, and then the government decides whether or not they're going to join the suit. And that, in this case, those four were TJ Novak, Elmer Mosley, K&V Group LLP, and Patrick Awa. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. I'm not sure about the K&V Group as I'm looking at this, but certainly TJ, Elmer, and Patrick were all pharmacists employed by Walgreens. So again, even though we don't know all the details, we can surmise, because this is typically how this happens, that they raised this issue multiple times and were either ignored, or it appears that Patrick Awa has a retaliation case still pending. So it's likely that even for reporting, they were either punished or retaliated in some way. Either way, they raised this issue and felt like it was not getting resolved. So what did the pharmacists do? They finally file suit, and their whistleblower. By the way, the whistleblower in this case, I think from what we know, TJ Novak is the only one that's actually getting a whistleblower settlement out of this 17.25% of the false claims portion of this case, which amounts to $25 million. And this was filed back in 2018. So here we are, really 6 years later, and it's finally being dealt with. So, I we don't know all the details of this case, but what's really interesting to me about this particular one is that there's this knowingly kind of, hey, we're going to turn a blind eye, which really sounds like what Walgreens was doing. Like, hey, if the prescriptions are coming in, our job is just to fill it. We're going to bill it. We're going to bill Medicare, even though there must have been danger signs and warning signs everywhere that these prescriptions were extremely problematic. So that's to me is a big lesson learned. And then the other one is clearly when your whistleblowers are internal employees, in this case, three pharmacists who are being pressured to fill these scripts, clearly there is a systemic compliance issue in this organization, a culture issue in this organization where those concerns were not being listened to. And if I knew all the details, I feel highly confident that it would speak to exactly that. So a couple of those lessons learned. Maybe the third lesson is that the government takes opioids very, very seriously. It's really reaching epidemic proportions in our country. It really, really is a challenge. And so you have in this case where you have clinical care, quality of care, likely harm or danger of care crossing over into false claims and regulatory issues and false payments. So you kind of have this meld. We often talk about in healthcare how compliance and quality often overlap in many different areas. This seems to be a prime example. In the notes of this post, I will also share a few of these highlights. If you want to read the case, you can go to DOJ's website and see the settlement yourself. But these are just some of the things that I saw, high level, and some lessons learned. Thanks for tuning in. Have a blessed day.